A deal that could never be broken. Caterina Esposito had been raised to be a dutiful bride, a perfect wife for a man she did not love. But before she could walk down the aisle, she was taken stolen by the man her father had warned her about. Enzo Costa's grip tightened on her wrist. "You were never meant for him," he murmured. "You were always meant to be mine." Chapter 1. The Reluctant Bride's Last Supper. The clinking of silverware against fine china was a delicate counterpoint to the low hum of strained conversation that filled the Esposito dining room. Caterina Esposito sat at the long, mahogany table, a meticulously crafted centerpiece of wilting lilies and flickering candles stretching between her and her father, Don Alessandro Esposito. The scent of roasted lamb, rosemary, and something subtly, suffocatingly old hung heavy in the air. It was the smell of tradition, of obligation, of a life she hadn't chosen. Caterina picked at the meticulously arranged food on her plate.
Arrosto di agnello.
Her grandmother's recipe, prepared with the utmost care by the family chef, yet it tasted like ash in her mouth. Across from her, her father, a man whose presence commanded respect and instilled a quiet, bone-deep fear, finally broke the silence. "Caterina," he began, his voice a low rumble that resonated with years of unspoken authority. "Tomorrow is a significant day. A day that will bind our family to the De Lucas, strengthening our position, ensuring our legacy." She forced a smile, a fragile, practiced thing. "Yes, Papa." Alessandro's eyes, the same dark, intense brown as her own, held a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, quickly masked by a steely resolve. "Antonio De Luca is a good man. A strong man. He will provide for you. Protect you." Protect her from what? From life itself? From the very world her father had built, brick by bloody brick? Caterina knew better than to voice these questions. She'd learned long ago that obedience was the only currency that mattered in their world. Silence was gold and defiance was defiance was unthinkable. Her gaze drifted to the large, ornate window overlooking the meticulously manicured gardens. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the lawn, turning the vibrant green to a somber, almost menacing shade. She imagined herself running, fleeing through those shadows, escaping the suffocating weight of expectation that pressed down on her like a physical burden. But where would she go? The Esposito name, and the world it represented, was a gilded cage, beautiful but inescapable. "He is generous," Caterina managed, the word feeling hollow even to her own ears. Generous with his wealth, perhaps, but what about his heart? She'd met Antonio De Luca only a handful of times, each encounter a carefully orchestrated performance of polite conversation and veiled assessments. He was handsome, in a severe, almost predatory way, but his eyes held a coldness that chilled her to the bone. He looked at her the way a collector might admire a prized possession with possessiveness, not affection. Her mother, Isabella, a woman whose beauty had faded into a quiet, resigned elegance, reached across the table and gently squeezed Caterina's hand. "He will cherish you, Cara," she said, her voice soft, yet tinged with a sadness that mirrored Caterina's own. Isabella had been a dutiful bride, too, traded like a valuable commodity to secure an alliance. Caterina wondered if her mother ever regretted the life she'd been given, the choices that had been made for her. "I know, Mama," Caterina replied, offering a weak smile. She knew her mother was trying to reassure her, to offer comfort in the only way she knew how. But the words felt empty, like echoes of a promise that could never truly be fulfilled. The meal continued, a slow, agonizing dance of polite conversation and forced smiles. Caterina felt like a porcelain doll, carefully posed and displayed, her internal turmoil hidden beneath a veneer of composure. She caught the eye of her younger brother, Marco, who sat further down the table, his youthful exuberance dimmed by the gravity of the occasion. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of understanding. Marco, at least, seemed to see her, to recognize the silent struggle beneath her placid exterior. Later, after the plates had been cleared and the servants had retreated, Alessandro rose from his chair, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the room. "Katerina," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "A word in my study." She followed him, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The study was a sanctuary of masculine power, filled with leather-bound books, antique weapons, and the lingering scent of cigar smoke. It was here that deals were made, alliances forged, and destinies decided. Alessandro gestured to a chair opposite his large, imposing desk. He sat down, his movements deliberate and purposeful. "You understand the importance of this union, Katerina," he said, his gaze unwavering. "The De Lucas are powerful allies. This marriage is not just about you, it's about the future of our family." "I understand, Papa," she repeated, the words feeling like a betrayal of her own heart. He leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "I know this is not easy, but sometimes duty requires sacrifice. And in return, you will have security, respect, a life of privilege."
Privilege.
The word tasted bitter on her tongue. What good was privilege when it came at the cost of her own freedom, her own desires? She longed for something more, something real, something authentic. Alessandro sighed, a rare display of vulnerability. "There are threats, Katerina. Enemies who would see our family fall. This marriage, it's a shield. It protects us all." She knew he was referring to the Costas, the rival family whose feud with the Espositos stretched back generations. A feud fueled by blood, betrayal, and a relentless pursuit of power. Enzo Costa, the heir to that family, was a name whispered in hushed tones, a figure of darkness and danger. He was everything her father warned her against. A threat, a predator, a storm on the horizon. And yet, a part of her, a rebellious, yearning part, couldn't help but be intrigued. The stories she'd overheard, the rumors she dismissed as fear-mongering, painted a picture of a man who was both ruthless and captivating. A man who defied convention, who lived by his own rules. A man who, unlike Antonio De Luca, might actually see her, not just the Esposito name. Alessandro stood, signaling the end of their conversation. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, a gesture meant to be reassuring, but which felt more like a weight. "Be strong, Katerina," he said. "Be the woman our family needs you to be." She nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. As she left the study, she felt a chilling premonition, a sense of impending doom. The carefully constructed world she knew was about to shatter. The storm was coming, and she had a feeling that Enzo Costa was at its center. The night held its breath, waiting. Chapter 2. Snatched away in the dead of night. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, offered little illumination as Katerina slipped out of her silken sheets. The Grand Esposito estate, usually a hive of activity, was shrouded in a heavy, expectant silence. Sleep had evaded her, replaced by a restless anxiety that thrummed beneath her skin. She padded across the plush carpet to the balcony, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her arms. The gardens below stretched out like a dark, velvet tapestry, the carefully manicured lawns and hedges dissolving into an indistinguishable mass. A lone owl hooted in the distance, its mournful cry echoing the emptiness in her heart. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. Tomorrow, she would be Katerina De Luca.
A wife.
A possession. A symbol of an alliance she didn't believe in, bound to a man she didn't love. The thought sent a fresh wave of despair washing over her. She closed her eyes, picturing a different life, a life where she could choose her own path, follow her own desires. A life where a sudden noise, a faint rustling in the bushes below, snapped her out of her reverie. She leaned over the railing, peering into the darkness. At first she saw nothing. Then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows, moving with a stealthy grace that sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. Another shadow followed, and then another. They were moving quickly, silently, towards the house. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that these were not servants. These were not guests. These were intruders. She turned to run back inside, to raise the alarm, but a hand clamped over her mouth, stifling her scream. Strong arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but her captor was too strong. He held her effortlessly, his body pressed close to hers, the scent of leather, smoke, and something subtly, dangerously masculine filling her nostrils. Silenzio. A voice hissed in her ear, a low, gravelly rumble that sent shivers down her spine. It was a voice she'd never heard before, yet it felt strangely familiar. A voice that belonged to the shadows, to the forbidden world her father had warned her about. She was carried swiftly, silently, through the gardens, away from the house, away from the life she knew. She caught glimpses of masked faces, dark clothing, the glint of steel in the moonlight. They were moving with a practiced efficiency, a coordinated precision that spoke of experience, of a world where violence was a way of life. They reached the edge of the property, where a black car waited, its engine idling like a restless beast. She was shoved roughly into the back seat, her head hitting the leather with a dull thud. The door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. The car sped off, tires squealing against the pavement, leaving the Esposito estate behind. Katerina was disoriented, terrified, her mind racing. Who were these men? What did they want? Was this a kidnapping? A ransom demand? Or something worse? The man who had grabbed her sat beside her, his presence filling the small space. She could feel his body heat, hear his steady breathing. He remained silent, a dark, imposing figure in the shadows. She gathered her courage, her voice trembling.
Who are you?
He didn't answer immediately. The car swerved, taking a sharp turn, throwing her against him. She felt the hard muscle of his arm, the solidness of his chest. He smelled of the night, of danger, of something that both terrified and intrigued her. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate through her very being. You know who I am, Katerina. She froze. That voice, it couldn't be. She strained to see his face in the darkness, but it was obscured by the shadows. Enzo? She whispered, the name escaping her lips like a forbidden prayer. He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a fresh wave of fear, mixed with a strange, unexpected thrill, through her. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear.
Sí, cara. Info Costa.
The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning.
The enemy.
The rival. The man her father had warned her about. The man who had just stolen her from her own home, on the eve of her wedding. The car continued its relentless journey, speeding through the dark, winding roads. Katerina felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was a prisoner, yes, but she was also free. Free from the suffocating expectations, the stifling obligations, the loveless marriage that awaited her. Enzo's grip tightened on her wrist, his fingers strong and possessive. He pulled her closer, his body pressed against hers. She could feel the hard contours of his muscles, the steady beat of his heart. You were never meant for him, he murmured, his voice a husky whisper that sent shivers down her spine. You were always meant to be mine. His words were a declaration, a promise, a threat. They hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, with a dangerous allure that both terrified and captivated her. She was his captive, yes, but she was also something more. Something she couldn't quite define. Something that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The car sped on, hurtling through the darkness, towards an unknown destination, an uncertain future. Katerina closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She was a prisoner of the shadows, caught in a web of family feuds, forbidden desires, and a dangerous game she didn't understand. But in that moment, surrounded by darkness and uncertainty, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Or perhaps something even more dangerous. The night whispered secrets she was only beginning to understand. Chapter 3. The Lion's Den of Secrets and Lies. The car finally came to a halt, the abrupt silence almost jarring after the constant hum of the engine. Katerina braced herself, her body tense with apprehension. The door was yanked open, revealing a dimly lit courtyard, the air thick with the scent of salt and sea air. She was roughly pulled from the vehicle, her feet stumbling on the uneven cobblestones. She found herself standing before a massive, imposing villa, its walls bathed in the soft glow of strategically placed lights. It was a fortress, a sanctuary, a prison all at once. The architecture was ancient, Romanesque, with towering columns and arched doorways, hinting at a history as rich and complex as the family that inhabited it. This was the Costa Estate, the Lion's Den itself, a place whispered about in hushed tones within the Esposito household. Enzo stood beside her, his hand still possessively gripping her arm. He didn't speak, simply gestured for her to follow him. She had no choice but to obey, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. They entered the villa, the heavy wooden doors closing behind them with a resounding thud that echoed through the vast, silent halls. The interior was even more opulent than she had imagined, a breathtaking display of wealth and power. Marble floors gleamed under the soft light of crystal chandeliers, antique furniture adorned with intricate carvings lined the walls, and priceless works of art hung in gilded frames. It was a world of beauty and luxury, but it also felt cold, impersonal, a stage set for a drama she was only beginning to understand. Enzo led her through a maze of corridors, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of a floorboard or the distant murmur of voices. She felt like a trespasser, an intruder in a world she didn't belong to. They finally reached a large, ornate door. Enzo paused, his hand resting on the intricately carved handle. He turned to her, his dark eyes, now visible in the soft light, holding a mixture of intensity and something else. Something that looked almost like concern? Inside, he said, his voice a low rumble. You will be safe. No one will harm you. Safe? From whom? From her family? From his?
From him? She didn't know what to believe.
She was caught in a web of lies and secrets, unsure of who to trust, what to expect. He opened the door, revealing a lavishly decorated bedroom. It was spacious and elegant, with a large four-poster bed draped in rich fabrics, a fireplace crackling merrily, and a balcony overlooking the moonlit sea. It was a room fit for a princess or a prisoner. "This is your room," Enzo said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will stay here
until I decide what to do with you."
His words sent a chill down her spine. She was at his mercy, her fate entirely in his hands. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a prize to be won or lost. He turned to leave, but she found her voice, a desperate plea escaping her lips. "Why, Enzo? Why did you take me?" He paused at the doorway, his back to her. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, he turned, his expression unreadable. "You ask too many questions, Katerina," he said, his voice a low growl. "For now, all you need to know is that you are here. And you will obey me." He left, closing the door behind him, the sound echoing like a final judgment. Katerina stood alone in the opulent room, feeling more lost and alone than she had ever felt in her life. She was a prisoner, yes, but she was also something more. A player in a dangerous game, a pawn in a centuries-old feud, a woman caught between two worlds, two families, two destinies. She walked to the balcony, the cool night air washing over her face. The sea stretched out before her, vast and endless, a mirror of the uncertainty that lay ahead. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the villa. She was in a lion's den, surrounded by secrets and lies.
But she was also alive.
And she was determined to survive. She would learn the rules of this game, uncover the truth, and find a way to reclaim her life, her freedom, her destiny. Even if it meant confronting the darkness that surrounded her, the darkness that had taken her captive, the darkness that was Enzo Costa. The waves crashed against the shore, a relentless rhythm mirroring the turmoil in her heart. The night was full of questions, and she was determined to find the answers. Chapter 4. Whispers of a Forbidden Past. The first few days at the Costa Villa were a blur of strained silence and watchful eyes. Katerina was confined to her room, her meals brought to her by a stern-faced housekeeper who refused to answer any of her questions. She spent her time exploring the room, pacing the floor, staring out at the sea, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Enzo remained an enigma. She saw him only fleetingly, usually across the vast expanse of the dining room, where he would preside over silent meals, his presence radiating a cold, detached power. He never spoke to her directly, never acknowledged her presence, yet she could feel his eyes on her, watching, assessing, calculating. She tried to piece together the puzzle of her abduction, to understand the motives behind Enzo's actions. Was it purely an act of revenge, a way to strike at her father, to disrupt the Esposito de Luca alliance? Or was there something more, something deeper, something personal? One afternoon, while exploring the villa's seemingly endless corridors, she stumbled upon a library. It was a vast, cavernous room, filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It was a sanctuary, a place of refuge, a world away from the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the rest of the villa. She spent hours in the library, losing herself in the pages of ancient books, searching for clues, for answers, for anything that might shed light on her situation. She discovered volumes on the history of the region, on the long-standing feud between the Espositos and the Costas, a feud that stretched back centuries, fueled by betrayal, bloodshed, and a relentless thirst for power. She learned of forbidden romances, of secret alliances, of broken vows and shattered dreams. She read of a time when an Esposito woman had been promised to a Costa man, a union meant to bring peace to the warring families. But the woman had loved another, and her betrayal had sparked a new wave of violence, a cycle of revenge that continued to this day. Katerina felt a strange connection to this long-dead woman, a kinship that transcended time and circumstance. She, too, was a pawn in a game of power, a woman whose fate was being decided by others. She, too, was caught between duty and desire, between the expectations of her family and the yearnings of her own heart. As she delved deeper into the history of the two families, she began to understand the complexities of the feud, the layers of resentment and mistrust that had built up over generations. It was more than just a power struggle, it was a deeply personal vendetta, a cycle of violence that seemed impossible to break. One evening, as she was returning to her room, she encountered Enzo in the hallway. He was standing by a window, staring out at the darkening sea, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. He seemed lost in thought, his usual air of cold command replaced by a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. She hesitated, unsure whether to speak or retreat. But something compelled her to approach him, to break the silence that had separated them. "Enzo," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. He turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. He didn't speak, simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I've been reading," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "about the history of our families, about the feud." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "And it's complicated," she said, choosing her words carefully. "More than I realized." He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "It is," he agreed, his voice low and gravelly. "Why did you bring me here, Enzo?" she asked, the question she had been holding back finally escaping her lips. "Was it just to hurt my father? To stop the wedding?" He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze intense and unwavering. "It was a necessity," he said finally, his voice devoid of emotion. "A necessity?" she repeated, her voice laced with confusion and frustration. "What does that mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of weariness that surprised her. "It means," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle, "that there are things you don't understand, Katerina. Things that are better left unknown." But I want to understand, she insisted, her voice rising slightly. I deserve to understand. I'm not just a prize to be won or lost. I'm a person, with my own thoughts, my own feelings. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. She could feel the warmth of his body, smell the familiar scent of leather and smoke. He looked down at her, his dark eyes holding a mixture of intensity and something else. Something that looked almost like regret. I know you are, he said, his voice a low murmur. And that is part of the problem. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jawline. The touch sent a shiver through her, a mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite name. There are things about my family, Katerina, he continued, his voice husky and intimate. Chapter 5. Unveiling the captor's scars. His touch lingered, a feather-light caress that sent a cascade of unexpected sensations through her. Katerina found herself unable to look away, caught in the intensity of his gaze. The hallway, the villa, the feud all seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a moment of unexpected intimacy. Things about your past, she whispered, her voice barely audible, prompting him to continue where he left off. He withdrew his hand, the sudden absence of his touch leaving a strange emptiness. He turned away, staring out the window once more, his profile etched against the fading light. He seemed to struggle with his words, his usual composure fractured by a vulnerability she hadn't witnessed before. My father, he began, his voice low and strained, was not a good man. He was ruthless, cruel, obsessed with power. He saw the feud with your family as a personal crusade. He believed that the Espositos were responsible for everything that went wrong in his life. Katerina listened intently, her heart aching for the boy who had grown up in the shadow of such a man. She could only imagine the darkness, the fear, the constant pressure to live up to such a twisted legacy. He trained me, Enzo continued, his voice laced with bitterness, to be his weapon. To hate your family, to seek revenge, to continue the cycle of violence. He paused, taking a deep breath, as if the memories themselves were suffocating him. I saw things, I did things that I can never forget. Things that haunt me. Katerina reached out, her hand instinctively touching his arm, a gesture of comfort, of understanding. He flinched slightly at her touch, as if surprised by her empathy. I'm sorry, Enzo, she said softly, her voice filled with genuine compassion. I can't imagine what that must have been like. He turned to her, his dark eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. He seemed to be wrestling with an internal conflict, torn between his ingrained distrust and a desperate need for connection. My mother, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She tried to protect me, to shield me from the darkness. But she was powerless. She died when I was young. Some say it was an accident. Others whisper of foul play. Katerina's heart clenched with a fresh wave of sorrow. She understood now, at least in part, the source of his pain, the root of his anger. He was a man scarred by his past, trapped in a cycle of violence he hadn't chosen. After she died, Enzo continued, his voice devoid of emotion. I was alone, surrounded by enemies, by people who only cared about power, about revenge. I learned to trust no one, to rely only on myself. He looked at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. And then you came along, the Esposito bride, the symbol of everything I was taught to hate, the key to disrupting my father's plans. But you didn't hurt me, Katerina said, her voice filled with a mixture of confusion and hope. You could have used me as leverage, but you didn't. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Don't mistake my actions for kindness, Katerina. I brought you here for a reason that goes beyond the feud, beyond my father's legacy. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming her senses. He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. There are secrets, Katerina, he whispered, his voice a husky murmur, that have been buried for generations. Secrets that could destroy us all. And you are the key to unlocking them. His words sent a shiver down her spine. She was caught in a web of intrigue, a dangerous game she didn't understand. But she was also intrigued. She sensed that there was more to Enzo than met the eye, that beneath the cold, ruthless exterior lay a complex, wounded soul. What secrets, Enzo? She asked, her voice barely audible. What are you talking about? He straightened, stepping back, creating a distance between them. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. That, he said, his voice firm and decisive, is something you will have to discover for yourself. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the hallway, her mind reeling with unanswered questions, with a growing sense of unease, and with a strange, unexpected fascination with the man who had stolen her from her life. The scars of his past were visible now, etched onto his soul, and she found herself drawn to them, to the darkness that surrounded him, to the mystery that he represented. She knew that she was playing with fire, that she was walking a dangerous path, but she couldn't turn back. She had to know the truth, even if it meant risking everything. The night was filled with whispers, and she was determined to decipher their meaning. Chapter 6. A glimmer of unexpected tenderness. The following days saw a subtle shift in the dynamic between Katerina and Enzo. He no longer completely ignored her presence, and the icy formality that had characterized their previous interactions began to thaw, replaced by a guarded curiosity. He would occasionally join her in the library, observing her from across the room as she pored over ancient texts, a silent, watchful presence. One afternoon, she found him standing by the window, staring out at the sea, his expression troubled. She approached him cautiously, unsure of his mood. "The sea, it's calming, isn't it?" she said softly, breaking the silence. He turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. He didn't speak, simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "It reminds me of freedom," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Of a life beyond these walls, beyond this feud." He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Freedom is an illusion, Katerina," he said finally, his voice devoid of emotion. "We are all prisoners of our past, of our circumstances, of our obligations. But we can choose to break free," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "To create our own destinies, to forgive." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Forgiveness is a luxury we cannot afford, Katerina, especially in our world. But without forgiveness," she countered, "there can be no peace. Only endless cycles of violence and revenge." He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. He looked down at her, his dark eyes holding a mixture of intensity and something else. Something that looked almost like admiration. "You are different, Katerina," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You have a strength, a spirit, that I haven't seen in a long time." His words surprised her, sending a warmth spreading through her chest. She had expected condemnation, anger, perhaps even violence. But not this. Not this unexpected glimpse of tenderness. "I just want to understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "I want to know why you brought me here, what you want from me." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jawline. The touch sent a shiver through her, a mixture of apprehension and something else, something she couldn't quite name. It was a repeat of the gesture from the previous night, but this time, it felt different. Less hesitant, more intimate. "Patience, Kara," he whispered, his voice husky and intimate. "All will be revealed in time." He withdrew his hand, the sudden absence of his touch leaving a strange emptiness. He turned away, his gaze returning to the sea. "There is a storm coming, Katerina," he said, his voice low and ominous. "A storm that will test us all. And you will need to be ready." His words sent a chill down her spine. She didn't know what he meant, what kind of storm he was referring to, but she sensed that it was something significant. Something that would change everything. Later that evening, as she was preparing for bed, there was a knock on her door. She opened it cautiously, expecting to see the stern-faced housekeeper. But it was Enzo, standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "I brought you something," he said, his voice unusually hesitant. He held out a small, velvet box. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her. She opened the box, revealing a delicate silver necklace, a single, perfectly formed pearl hanging from a slender chain. It was exquisite, simple yet elegant, a stark contrast to the opulent jewelry she was accustomed to. "It was my mother's," Enzo said, his voice a low murmur. "I wanted you to have it." Katerina was speechless. This unexpected gesture of kindness, of generosity, left her reeling. It was a glimpse of the man beneath the mask, the wounded soul beneath the ruthless exterior. "Thank you, Enzo," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's beautiful." He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. He didn't speak, simply looked at her, his dark eyes holding a depth of emotion she couldn't quite decipher. He turned to leave, but she stopped him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Enzo," she said softly, "tell me about your mother." He paused, his back to her. He hesitated for a long moment, as if wrestling with an internal conflict. Then he turned, his expression vulnerable, his guard lowered. "She was everything to me," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "She was the only light in my life, the only person who loved me unconditionally." He told her about his mother's kindness, her compassion, her unwavering belief in the good in people, even in the midst of darkness. He spoke of her love for music, for art, for beauty, for all the things that had been denied to him in his upbringing. As he spoke, Katerina saw a different side of Enzo, a side that was gentle, vulnerable, and deeply human. She saw the boy who had lost his mother too soon, the man who had been forced to grow up too fast, the soul who had been scarred by violence and betrayal. The night was filled with a shared vulnerability, a connection forged in the crucible of their shared pain, and a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the darkness that surrounded them could be overcome. The pearl necklace, a tangible symbol of that hope, rested against her skin, a reminder of the unexpected tenderness she had found in the heart of her captor. A quiet understanding began to bloom. Chapter 7. The Price of Loyalty, the Cost of Freedom. The tentative peace that had settled between Katerina and Enzo was shattered by the arrival of a visitor. A man named Ricardo, Enzo's second in command, a figure as imposing and ruthless as Enzo himself, but lacking any hint of his subtle complexities. Ricardo's presence brought with it a palpable tension, reminder of the dangerous world that lay just beyond the walls of the villa. Ricardo treated Katerina with a barely concealed contempt, his eyes assessing her like a piece of property, a liability to be dealt with. He spoke to Enzo in hushed tones, his words laced with urgency and concern. Katerina caught snippets of their conversations: Espositos, De Lucas, alliance, threat, revenge. She realized that her abduction had not only disrupted her own life, but had also thrown the delicate balance of power between the families into chaos. Her father, she knew, would be furious, demanding her return, seeking retribution. Antonio De Luca, her betrothed, would be humiliated, his pride wounded, his ambitions thwarted. One evening, she overheard a heated argument between Enzo and Ricardo in the study. "You are playing a dangerous game, Enzo," Ricardo hissed, his voice low and menacing. "Keeping her here, treating her like a guest. It's a weakness. It makes us vulnerable." "She is not a weapon, Ricardo," Enzo retorted, his voice equally forceful. "She is a pawn, and I will use her as I see fit." "She's an Esposito," Ricardo spat back. "She's the enemy. She should be dealt with." "I will decide what to do with her," Enzo said, his voice cold and decisive. "And you will obey my orders." The argument ended abruptly, leaving Katerina shaken and confused. She was a pawn, yes, but she was also something more. Enzo's words, his actions, his unexpected moments of tenderness, suggested a deeper, more complex motive than simple revenge. Later that night, Enzo found her in the library, her nose buried in a book, pretending to read. He stood silently for a moment, watching her, his expression unreadable. "Ricardo doesn't approve of you," he said finally, breaking the silence. Katerina looked up, her eyes meeting his. "I gathered that," she replied, her voice laced with sarcasm. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "He thinks I'm softening. That you're distracting me. And are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. He looked down at her, his dark eyes holding a mixture of intensity and something else. Something that looked almost like desire. "Perhaps," he admitted, his voice a low murmur. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jawline. The touch sent a shiver through her, a familiar mixture of apprehension and excitement. It was becoming a ritual, this touch, a silent communication that spoke volumes. "But you understand the risks, don't you, Katerina?" he continued, his voice husky and intimate. "The price of loyalty. The cost of freedom." She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She understood that her presence in the Costa Villa was a dangerous game, a delicate balancing act between two warring families. She was caught in the middle, a pawn in a power struggle, a woman with a price on her head. "My father, he won't give up," she said, her voice trembling slightly.
"He'll come for me."
"Let him come," Enzo said, his voice cold and defiant. "I'm ready for him." His words sent a chill down her spine. She knew that a confrontation was inevitable, that the storm he had spoken of was fast approaching. And she was terrified. Not just for herself, but for Enzo, for the man she was beginning to care for, despite everything. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "What happens then, Enzo?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What happens to us?" He didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a depth of emotion she couldn't quite decipher. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Then, Kara," he whispered, "we fight. For our lives. For our future. For whatever destiny awaits us." His words were both a promise and a threat, a declaration of war and a whispered vow. She was caught in a web of loyalty and betrayal, of love and hate, of freedom and captivity. And she knew that the choices she made in the coming days would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of everyone around her. The price of loyalty was high, the cost of freedom even higher. But she was ready to pay it, whatever it might be. The night was charged with unspoken promises and imminent danger. Chapter 8. Echoes of betrayal in the palazzo walls. The atmosphere in the villa grew increasingly tense. Riccardo's presence was a constant, looming threat, his distrust of Katerina palpable. He shadowed Enzo, whispering warnings, urging caution, his every glance at Katerina filled with suspicion. Enzo, however, seemed to be growing more distant, more preoccupied, spending hours locked away in his study, poring over documents, making calls, his face etched with a grim determination. Katerina found herself drawn to the older parts of the villa, the sections that whispered of generations past, of lives lived and lost within these walls. She discovered a hidden courtyard, overgrown with ivy and fragrant jasmine, a forgotten fountain at its center, its water still and murky. It was a place of solitude, a refuge from the suffocating tension that permeated the rest of the house. One afternoon, while exploring the courtyard, she noticed a small, wooden door, almost hidden by the overgrown ivy. It was unlocked. Curiosity overcoming her caution, she pushed it open, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading down into darkness. She descended cautiously, the air growing colder and damper with each step. The staircase opened into a small, stone chamber, lit only by a single flickering candle. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with dusty bottles and jars, strange instruments, and ancient books. It was a hidden apothecary, a relic from a bygone era. As she examined the contents of the shelves, she noticed a small, leather-bound diary, tucked away in a corner. She pulled it out, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The writing was faded, but legible, a woman's elegant script. She began to read, her heart pounding in her chest. The diary belonged to Isabella Costa, Enzo's grandmother, the woman whose tragic love affair had fueled the feud between the Espositos and the Costas generations ago. Isabella's words painted a vivid picture of a passionate, forbidden love, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between two warring families. She wrote of her secret meetings with Alessandro Esposito's grandfather, of their shared dreams, of their hopes for a future where their families could live in peace. But her story was also filled with betrayal, with deceit, with a tragic ending that had shattered her dreams and condemned her to a life of sorrow. She wrote of a secret agreement, a pact between the two families, a promise of marriage that had been broken, a betrayal that had led to violence and bloodshed. Caterina realized, with a growing sense of horror, that the history she had read in the library was incomplete, distorted by time and prejudice. Isabella's diary revealed a different truth, a truth that had been buried for generations, a truth that could change everything. She learned that Isabella had not betrayed her lover, as the official history claimed. She had been betrayed by him, by a conspiracy within his own family, a plot to seize power and destroy the Costas. She had been used as a pawn, a sacrifice, a victim of a ruthless ambition that had condemned her and her unborn child. Caterina felt a surge of empathy for Isabella, a kinship that transcended time and circumstance. She, too, was a pawn in a game of power, a woman caught between two warring families. She, too, was facing betrayal, deceit, and an uncertain future. As she continued to read, she discovered a hidden compartment within the diary, a secret pocket containing a single, faded photograph. It was a picture of Isabella, young and beautiful, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sadness. And standing beside her, his arm around her waist, was not Alessandro Esposito's grandfather, but another man. A man with a familiar face, a face that sent a shiver of recognition down her spine. It was a younger version of Ricardo. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Ricardo's family, not the Espositos, had been the true betrayers. They had orchestrated the tragedy, manipulated the events, and used Isabella as a pawn in their quest for power. And now, Ricardo was here, in the Costa Villa, whispering poison in Enzo's ear. Plotting what? Caterina knew that she had to tell Enzo, that she had to reveal the truth, before it was too late. But she also knew that Ricardo was dangerous, that he would stop at nothing to protect his family's secrets. She was caught in a web of lies and deceit, surrounded by enemies, unsure of who to trust. She closed the diary, her hands trembling. The echoes of betrayal resonated through the ancient walls, a chilling reminder of the past, a warning of the present, and a threat to the future. She had to act quickly, decisively, before the darkness consumed them all. The palazzo held its breath, waiting for the truth to be unveiled. Chapter 9. Dancing on the edge of desire and danger. Armed with the shocking revelation from Isabella's diary, Caterina knew she had to confront Enzo. But finding the right moment, a moment when Ricardo wasn't lurking, proved to be a challenge. The tension in the villa was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every whispered conversation, every glance, loaded with suspicion. One evening, however, an opportunity presented itself. Enzo, after a particularly tense dinner during which Ricardo had pointedly ignored Caterina, suggested a walk in the gardens. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the manicured lawns and hedges, the scent of night-blooming jasmine heavy in the air. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the nearby shore. Caterina could feel Enzo's gaze on her, questioning, searching, his usual guarded expression softened by a hint of vulnerability. "You've been quiet," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that blended with the night sounds. "I've been thinking," she replied, her voice equally soft. "About everything. About your family, about mine, about us." He stopped walking, turning to face her, his dark eyes intense in the moonlight. "And what have you concluded?" She hesitated, unsure of how to begin, how to reveal the truth without jeopardizing her own safety. She decided to approach it indirectly, testing the waters. "I've been reading more about the history of the feud," she said, choosing her words carefully. About Isabella Costa and your great-grandfather. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Isabella? What about her? The stories, they don't always tell the whole truth, do they? She said, her voice barely a whisper. Sometimes things are distorted, manipulated, to serve a different purpose. He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. History is written by the victors, Katerina. It's rarely objective. But what if the victors were wrong? She challenged, her voice gaining strength. What if the story we've all been told is a lie? He stepped closer, his presence filling her senses. He looked down at her, his dark eyes holding a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What are you saying, Katerina? He asked, his voice a low murmur. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I found something, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Something that changes everything. Something that reveals a betrayal. But not the betrayal we've all been led to believe. She told him about the hidden apothecary, about Isabella's diary, about the photograph, about Ricardo's family's role in the tragedy. She spoke quickly, urgently, pouring out the truth in a torrent of words, her fear mingling with a desperate hope that he would believe her. Enzo listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, simply absorb her words, his gaze unwavering. When she had finished, he remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the gentle breeze. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. You're saying that Ricardo's family betrayed my grandmother? That they orchestrated the whole thing? Yes, Katerina said, her voice firm and decisive. That's exactly what I'm saying. He turned away, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration and disbelief. It's impossible, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Ricardo, he's my most trusted advisor. He's family. But the evidence, it's undeniable, Katerina insisted, her voice rising slightly. The photograph, Isabella's own words, it all points to them. He turned back to her, his dark eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge her sincerity, to find some flaw in her story. He seemed to be wrestling with an internal conflict, torn between his loyalty to Ricardo and the shocking truth she had revealed. Why would they do it? He asked, his voice raw with emotion. What was their motive? Power, Katerina said, her voice filled with conviction. They wanted to control the Costa family, to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. And Isabella, she was an obstacle. Enzo stepped closer, his proximity both thrilling and dangerous. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, the familiar gesture sending a shiver through her. But this time, there was something different in his touch, a desperation, a need for connection. I don't know what to believe, he said, his voice husky and intimate. But I trust you, Katerina. I trust your instincts. Your heart. His words sent a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling of hope, of something more. She had broken through his defenses, reached the man beneath the mask, the wounded soul beneath the ruthless exterior. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. She responded, her lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, a slow, sensual exploration, a dance of desire and danger, a moment of shared vulnerability in a world of secrets and lies. The kiss was a spark, igniting a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface, a fire fueled by their shared danger, their forbidden attraction, their growing love. It was a dance on the edge of the abyss, a moment of reckless abandon in the face of impending doom. They were playing with fire and they both knew it, but neither of them could resist. The night was alive with passion and peril, a prelude to the storm that was about to break. Chapter 10. A test of trust amidst shifting sands. The kiss lingered in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of the dangerous, undeniable connection that had formed. Enzo pulled back slightly, his dark eyes searching Katerina's, a mixture of desire and uncertainty swirling within them. The gardens, once a sanctuary of peace, now felt charged with a palpable tension, a prelude to the storm they both knew was coming. We need to be careful, Enzo said, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm against her skin. Ricardo, he's suspicious. He won't hesitate to act if he thinks I'm wavering. Katerina nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the danger they were in, the precariousness of their situation. They were walking a tightrope, balanced between trust and betrayal, love and hate, survival and destruction. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We need proof," Enzo said, his voice firm and decisive. "Something more than Isabella's diary. Something that will convince others. Something that will expose Ricardo's lies." They decided to search Ricardo's quarters, a risky move, but one they deemed necessary. They waited until late at night, when the villa was shrouded in darkness and silence. Enzo, using his intimate knowledge of the house, led Katerina through the labyrinthine corridors, avoiding the guards, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. Ricardo's room was austere and functional, reflecting his personality: cold, efficient, devoid of any personal touches. They searched systematically, checking every drawer, every shelf, every hidden compartment. They found nothing. Just as they were about to give up, Katerina noticed a small, antique box on Ricardo's desk, partially hidden beneath a stack of papers. It was locked. Enzo, using a small tool he carried with him, quickly picked the lock. Inside, they found a collection of letters, old and yellowed, written in the same elegant script as Isabella's diary. But these letters were not written by Isabella, they were written to her, from Ricardo's grandfather. The letters confirmed everything Katerina had suspected. They revealed a detailed plan to betray Isabella, to manipulate the Espositos, to seize control of the Costa family. They were filled with promises of love and devotion, masking a ruthless ambition, a cold-blooded calculation to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. But there was one letter that stood out from the rest. It was dated just days before Isabella's supposed accident, and it contained a chilling order. Eliminate her. And the child. Make it look like an accident. Leave no trace. Katerina felt a surge of nausea, a wave of horror washing over her. This was the proof they needed, the undeniable evidence of Ricardo's family's treachery. Enzo read the letter, his face paling with each word, his hands trembling. He looked at Katerina, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of rage and pain. "He killed her," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He killed my grandmother. And my uncle." Katerina reached out, her hand gently touching his arm, a gesture of comfort, of solidarity. "I'm so sorry, Enzo," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine compassion. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. He was a man torn between his loyalty to a trusted advisor and the shocking truth that had been revealed. "We need to show this to the others," he said finally, his voice firm and decisive. "To the elders of the family. To everyone." But as they were about to leave Ricardo's room, they heard a noise outside the door. A key turning in the lock. Footsteps approaching. They were trapped. Ricardo entered the room, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He saw them, saw the open box, saw the letters in Enzo's hand. His expression changed from surprise to anger to cold, calculating rage. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. Enzo stepped forward, his body shielding Katerina. "We know the truth, Ricardo," he said, his voice cold and defiant. "We know about your family's betrayal. About Isabella. About everything." Ricardo chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You know nothing," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're being manipulated by this Esposito whore. She's poisoned your mind with her lies." "The letters, they speak for themselves," Enzo retorted, his voice rising slightly. "They prove your guilt." Ricardo drew a gun, his movements swift and practiced. He pointed it at Enzo, his finger on the trigger. "You should have stayed out of this, Enzo," he said, his voice cold and deadly. "You should have trusted me. Now it's too late." Katerina screamed, a desperate, piercing sound that echoed through the silent villa. She lunged forward, pushing Enzo out of the way, just as Ricardo fired. The bullet grazed her arm, a searing pain that sent her stumbling backward. The room was plunged into chaos, a maelstrom of violence and betrayal, a test of trust amidst shifting sands. The night was shattered by the sound of gunfire and the screams of a woman caught in the crossfire. Chapter 11. The Serpent's Kiss of Jealousy and Revenge. The gunshot echoed through the villa, shattering the fragile peace and plunging everything into chaos. Katerina cried out, clutching her arm, the searing pain a stark reminder of the danger they were in. Enzo, recovering from the shock of being pushed aside, reacted instantly. He tackled Ricardo, wrestling him to the ground, the gun clattering across the floor. The two men grappled fiercely, a tangle of limbs and rage, their years of friendship and loyalty dissolving in a maelstrom of violence and betrayal. Katerina, despite her injury, scrambled to her feet, her eyes searching for the discarded weapon. She spotted it, lying near the fireplace, gleaming in the dim light. She lunged for it, her fingers closing around the cold metal, just as Ricardo managed to throw Enzo off him. Ricardo scrambled to his feet, his face contorted with fury, his eyes locked on Enzo. "You were a fool, Enzo," he spat, his voice hoarse with exertion. "A weak, sentimental fool. You should have listened to me. You should have eliminated her." He lunged at Enzo again, his hands reaching for his throat. But before he could reach him, Katerina raised the gun, her hands trembling, her aim unsteady. "Stop," she cried, her voice cracking with fear and desperation. Don't make me do this." Ricardo froze, his eyes widening in surprise. He looked at Katerina, a flicker of disbelief in his gaze. He hadn't expected her, the Esposito bride, the pampered princess, to have the courage, the ruthlessness, to defend Enzo. "You won't shoot," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You don't have the stomach for it. You're weak. Just like him." Katerina's grip tightened on the gun, her finger pressing against the trigger. She looked at Enzo, his face bruised and bloodied, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. She knew that she had to protect him, that she had to stop Ricardo, before it was too late. "I don't want to hurt you, Ricardo," she said, her voice trembling, but firm. "But I will if I have to." Ricardo hesitated, his eyes darting between Katerina and Enzo. He seemed to be calculating his chances, weighing his options. He was trapped, outnumbered, his carefully constructed lies exposed. Suddenly, the door burst open, and several of Enzo's guards rushed into the room, their weapons drawn. They had been alerted by the gunshot, by Katerina's scream. They quickly assessed the situation, their eyes taking in the scene of violence, the struggling men, the injured woman holding a gun. Enzo, seeing his opportunity, managed to break free from Ricardo's grasp. He stood panting, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with anger. "Arrest him," he ordered, his voice cold and decisive. "He's a traitor, a murderer." The guards hesitated, their loyalty divided. Ricardo had been Enzo's second in command, a trusted advisor, a powerful figure within the family. They looked at Enzo, then at Ricardo, unsure of who to believe, who to obey. Enzo held up the letters, his voice rising above the chaos. "These letters, they prove his guilt. They reveal his family's betrayal, their treachery. They killed my grandmother. They tried to kill me." The guards, seeing the evidence, the undeniable proof of Ricardo's crimes, finally moved. They disarmed Ricardo, forcing him to his knees, his hands bound behind his back. He didn't resist, his spirit broken, his carefully constructed world shattered. He looked at Enzo, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and despair. "You'll regret this, Enzo," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You'll pay for this. My family we won't forget. We won't forgive." Enzo ignored him, his gaze fixed on Katerina. He rushed to her side, his hands gently examining her injured arm. "Are you all right, Kara?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "You're bleeding." "It's just a graze," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was a symbol of the violence that had erupted, of the danger that still lurked, of the price they had paid for uncovering the truth. It was a reminder of the serpent's kiss of jealousy and revenge, a kiss that had poisoned the Costa family for generations. Enzo ripped a strip of fabric from his shirt, using it to bandage her wound. His touch was gentle, tender, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion she hadn't seen before. It was a moment of intimacy amidst the chaos, a connection forged in the crucible of violence and betrayal. The villa was in uproar, but in that small, shared moment, there was only them. The night was a tapestry of pain, betrayal, and a fragile, blossoming love. Chapter 12. Unraveling the Threads of Family Secrets. With Ricardo's arrest, a wave of shock and disbelief rippled through the Costa household. The elders of the family, men and women who had known Ricardo for decades, were summoned to an emergency council. Enzo, his face still bruised from the fight, presented the evidence. Isabella's diary, the incriminating letters, Caterina's testimony. The elders listened in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. Ricardo, bound and guarded, stood before them, his usual arrogance replaced by a sullen defiance. He refused to speak, refusing to defend himself, his silence a tacit admission of guilt. The council chamber, a grand, ornate room filled with portraits of past Costa ancestors, felt heavy with the weight of history, with the echoes of betrayal and revenge. Caterina, her arm bandaged, stood beside Enzo, her presence a silent testament to her courage, her loyalty, her unwavering belief in the truth. The elders interrogated Enzo, questioning him rigorously, testing his resolve, challenging his accusations. They were hesitant to believe that Ricardo, a man they had trusted implicitly, could be capable of such treachery. These letters, they could be forgeries, one elder suggested, his voice skeptical. Isabella's diary, it's just the ramblings of a heartbroken woman, another argued. Caterina, she's an Esposito, a third elder pointed out, his voice laced with suspicion. She has a motive to lie, to sow discord within our family. Enzo, however, remained steadfast. He presented the evidence meticulously, patiently, his voice calm and resolute. He spoke of his own initial doubts, his own struggle to accept the truth, but he emphasized the undeniable nature of the evidence, the irrefutable proof of Ricardo's guilt. Caterina, when questioned, spoke with a quiet dignity, her voice clear and unwavering. She recounted her discovery of the diary, her reading of the letters, her realization of Ricardo's family's treachery. She spoke of her growing relationship with Enzo, of her trust in him, of her belief in his integrity. The elders listened intently, their faces etched with concern, their eyes searching for any sign of deception, any hint of falsehood. But Caterina's sincerity, her unwavering gaze, her genuine compassion, disarmed them. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the elders reached a verdict. Ricardo was found guilty of treason, of conspiracy, of murder. He was stripped of his rank, his title, his position within the family. He was banished from the Costa estate, exiled from their world, his name forever tarnished. As Ricardo was led away, his face contorted with rage and despair, he spat at Enzo's feet. "You'll pay for this, Enzo," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "My family we won't forget. We won't forgive." Enzo ignored him, his gaze fixed on Caterina. He reached out, taking her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. It was a public display of affection, a declaration of his trust, his loyalty, his love. The elders, witnessing this gesture, exchanged glances. They understood the significance of this moment, the symbolic union of two families, two enemies, brought together by a shared quest for truth, for justice, for peace. With Ricardo's treachery exposed, the threads of long-held family secrets began to unravel. The truth about Isabella's death, about the manipulated feud, about the years of lies and deceit, came to light. The Costa family was forced to confront its past, to acknowledge its mistakes, to atone for its sins. It was a painful process, a time of reckoning, a period of intense introspection. But it was also a time of healing, of reconciliation, of hope. The Costas, freed from the shackles of the past, could finally begin to build a new future, a future based on truth, on justice, on love. Enzo, with Caterina by his side, began to implement changes, to reform the family's practices, to dismantle the structures of power that had allowed Ricardo's treachery to flourish. He reached out to the Espositos, seeking a truce, a reconciliation, a way to end the centuries-old feud. It was a long and arduous process, but one he was determined to pursue. The weight of generations rested on his shoulders, but with Caterina's support, he felt capable of bearing it. The villa, once a den of secrets, began to feel like a home, a place of healing and hope. Chapter 13. Broken Vows and Rekindled Flames. The news of Ricardo's betrayal and Enzo's subsequent actions reached the Esposito estate like a thunderclap. Don Alessandro Esposito, Caterina's father, was initially enraged, demanding her immediate return, threatening retribution against the Costas. He refused to believe that his daughter, his dutiful daughter, could have willingly sided with the enemy. Antonio de Luca, Caterina's spurned fiancé, was equally furious, his pride wounded, his ambitions thwarted. He fueled Alessandro's anger, whispering of conspiracies, of Enzo's manipulative nature, of Caterina's weakness. However, Marco, Caterina's younger brother, the only member of the Esposito family who had shown her genuine understanding, secretly contacted Enzo. He had always sensed Caterina's unhappiness, her quiet desperation, her longing for a life beyond the confines of their world. He believed her, trusted her, and he was willing to act as a mediator, a bridge between the two warring families. Through Marco, Enzo sent a message to Alessandro, requesting a meeting, a chance to explain, to present the evidence, to seek a peaceful resolution. Alessandro, initially resistant, was eventually persuaded by Marco's pleas and by the growing unrest within his own family. The elders, hearing rumors of the events at the Costa Villa, were beginning to question Alessandro's leadership, his unwavering adherence to the ancient feud. The meeting was arranged to be held at a neutral location, a secluded villa halfway between the Esposito and Costa estates. It was a tense, highly charged encounter, fraught with suspicion and animosity. Caterina, accompanied by Enzo and Marco, faced her father, her mother, and Antonio. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with years of resentment, with the weight of broken vows and shattered expectations. Alessandro looked at Caterina, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "You betrayed me, Caterina," he said, his voice low and strained. "You betrayed your family. You sided with our enemies." Caterina stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "I did what I thought was right, Papa," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "I uncovered the truth. I exposed a traitor." She recounted the events of the past weeks, her voice filled with emotion, her passion evident. She spoke of Isabella's diary, of the incriminating letters, of Ricardo's treachery. She spoke of her growing relationship with Enzo, of her trust in him, of her love. Antonio scoffed, his face contorted with jealousy and rage. "She's been brainwashed," he spat. "Enzo has seduced her, manipulated her. She's under his spell." Enzo stepped forward, his voice cold and defiant. "I have done no such thing," he said, his gaze locking with Antonio's. "Caterina is here of her own free will. She is my partner, my equal." He presented the evidence to Alessandro, the letters, the diary, the testimony of the Costa elders. Alessandro examined the documents carefully, his face etched with concern, his eyes searching for any sign of deception. Isabella, Caterina's mother, spoke for the first time, her voice soft, yet firm. "Alessandro," she said, her hand reaching out to touch her husband's arm. "We must listen. We must consider the possibility that we have been wrong, that we have been living a lie." Her words, spoken with quiet dignity, had a profound impact on Alessandro. He looked at his wife, his daughter, his son, and then at Enzo, his gaze searching, questioning. He was a man torn between his ingrained beliefs, his deeply held prejudices, and the undeniable evidence before him. Finally, after a long and agonizing silence, Alessandro spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. I don't know what to believe, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But I will consider what you have said. I will investigate further. The meeting ended without a resolution, without a definitive agreement. But it was a start. A crack had appeared in the wall of hatred and mistrust that had separated the two families for generations. A seed of hope had been planted. As Katerina and Enzo left the villa, their hands clasped tightly together, they knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous. But they were ready to face it together. They had broken the vows of the past, shattered the expectations of their families, and rekindled the flames of a love that had been forbidden for generations. The future was uncertain, but it was also filled with possibility. They had chosen their own path, and they would walk it, hand in hand, come what may. The weight of the past was heavy, but the promise of the future was even stronger. Chapter 14. Blood Ties and Heartfelt Confessions. Following the tense meeting, Alessandro Esposito launched his own investigation into the claims made by Katerina and Enzo. He spoke with members of his own family, consulted with trusted advisors, and even, secretly, reached out to some of the Costa elders who had corroborated Enzo's story. The deeper he delved, the more uneasy he became. The evidence, though circumstantial in some areas, was compelling, and it painted a picture far different from the one he had believed his entire life. Meanwhile, Katerina and Enzo returned to the Costa Villa. The atmosphere there markedly changed. The pall of suspicion and fear that Ricardo had cast was lifting, replaced by a cautious optimism. The household staff, initially wary of Katerina, began to treat her with a newfound respect, even affection. They saw the change in Enzo, the softening of his hardened exterior, the genuine love and concern he displayed towards her. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the moonlit sea, Enzo turned to Katerina, his dark eyes filled with a depth of emotion she hadn't seen before. "I never thought I could feel this way," he said, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm against her skin. "After everything. After my father, after my mother's death, after the life I've lived." Katerina reached out, her hand gently touching his cheek, her fingers tracing the contours of his face. "I know," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. "It's hard to trust, to let someone in. But you broke through," he continued, his voice husky and intimate. "You saw something in me, something I didn't even know existed." He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. She responded, her lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, a slow, sensual exploration, a silent affirmation of their love, their trust, their shared journey. "I love you, Katerina," he said, his voice raw with emotion, the words hanging in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. "I love you, Enzo," she replied, her voice equally heartfelt, her eyes shining with tears. It was a moment of profound connection, a declaration of love born out of adversity, forged in the crucible of betrayal and violence. They had found each other in the darkness, and they were determined to hold onto the light, to build a future together, a future free from the shadows of the past. A few days later, Marco arrived at the Costa Villa, bearing news from his father. Alessandro had completed his investigation. He had found corroborating evidence, hidden documents, suppressed testimonies that confirmed Ricardo's family's treachery. He was ready to acknowledge the truth. Marco also brought a personal message from Isabella, Katerina's mother. A letter filled with love, with regret, with a heartfelt plea for forgiveness. Isabella had always suspected the truth, but she had been too afraid, too powerless to speak out. She had lived a life of quiet desperation, of silent sorrow, trapped in a loveless marriage, haunted by the ghosts of the past. Katerina read the letter, her eyes filled with tears. She understood her mother's pain, her mother's sacrifices, her mother's love. She wrote back, a letter filled with forgiveness, with understanding, with a promise of reconciliation. The blood ties that had bound her to a life of duty and obligation were loosening, replaced by the heartfelt confessions of a love that transcended family feuds and ancient hatreds. She was finding her own voice, her own strength, her own family. The stage was set for a final confrontation, a final reckoning, a chance to heal the wounds of the past and build a new future. The truth had been revealed, the lies exposed, the betrayals acknowledged. But the path to peace was still fraught with danger, with uncertainty, with the lingering threat of revenge. The past was not yet buried, but it no longer held them captive. They were ready to face it, together, armed with love, with truth, with a shared hope for a brighter future. The air was thick with anticipation, a sense of impending change, a turning point in the long and bloody history of the two families. Chapter 15. Running from the past, towards an uncertain future. Despite the progress made, a palpable unease lingered. The threat of Ricardo's family, the lingering resentment from some members of both the Esposito and Costa clans, and Antonio de Luca's wounded pride created a volatile cocktail of potential dangers. Enzo, ever vigilant, increased security at the villa, his instincts screaming that the calm was merely the eye of the storm. One evening, as Caterina and Enzo were walking in the gardens, discussing plans for a formal meeting between the two families, a shot rang out. Enzo, reacting instantly, pushed Caterina to the ground, shielding her with his body. The bullet whizzed past them, embedding itself in a nearby tree. Chaos erupted. Guards rushed to the scene, their weapons drawn, searching for the shooter. Caterina, shaken but unharmed, clung to Enzo, her heart pounding in her chest. "Are you all right, Cara?" Enzo asked, his voice urgent, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of injury. I think so," she replied, her voice trembling.
Who was it?
They didn't find the shooter. He, or she, had vanished into the night, leaving behind only a chilling reminder of the dangers they still faced. The attempted assassination shattered the fragile peace, throwing everything into uncertainty. "We need to leave," Enzo said, his voice firm and decisive. "This place, it's no longer safe. They know where we are. They'll keep coming." Caterina nodded, her agreement immediate. She trusted Enzo's instincts, his judgment. She knew that they were running out of time, that they needed to disappear, to protect themselves, to survive. They decided to flee to a secluded safe house, a small, unassuming villa in the countryside, far from the prying eyes of their enemies. They packed quickly, taking only the essentials, leaving behind the opulent world of the Costa estate, the gilded cage that had become their sanctuary, their prison, their home. They left under the cover of darkness, escorted by a small contingent of trusted guards. They drove through the night, the landscape blurring past them, their destination unknown, their future uncertain. Caterina looked at Enzo, his face etched with concern, his eyes focused on the road ahead. She reached out, her hand gently touching his arm, a gesture of comfort, of solidarity, of love. "Where are we going, Enzo?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Somewhere safe," he replied, his voice equally soft. "Somewhere they won't find us. Somewhere we can start over." His words were both a promise and a prayer, a desperate attempt to escape the past, to build a new life, a life free from the violence, the betrayal, the hatred that had consumed their families for generations. They arrived at the safe house just before dawn. It was a small, rustic villa, surrounded by vineyards and olive groves, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers and the sound of birdsong. It was a world away from the opulent estates of their families, a place of peace, of tranquility, of anonymity. They spent the next few days settling in, creating a semblance of normalcy, trying to find a rhythm in their new, uncertain life. They cooked together, they walked in the fields, they talked for hours, sharing their hopes, their fears, their dreams. But the past was not so easily escaped. The threat of their enemies lingered, a constant shadow hanging over them. They knew that they couldn't hide forever, that they would eventually have to confront their pursuers, to fight for their future. They were running from the past, yes, but they were also running towards something uncertain, something dangerous, but also something hopeful. They were running towards a future where they could be together, free from the constraints of their families, free from the burden of their history, free to love. The road ahead was long and winding, but they were determined to walk it, hand in hand, come what may. The sanctuary of the countryside offered a temporary reprieve, but the storm was still brewing on the horizon. Chapter 16. The storm breaks. Confrontation and revelation. The fragile peace of their secluded hideaway was shattered just as Enzo had feared. It was a moonless night, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets, when the attack came. A coordinated assault, swift and brutal, designed to overwhelm their defenses. Enzo, ever vigilant, had anticipated this. He had reinforced the security around the villa, setting up traps, deploying guards, preparing for the inevitable. But even his meticulous preparations were not enough to prevent the chaos that ensued. Gunfire erupted, shattering the stillness of the night. Explosions rocked the ground, sending debris flying through the air. The safe house, once a sanctuary of peace, became a battleground. Katerina, awakened by the noise, found Enzo already armed and ready, his face grim, his eyes blazing with a cold, determined fury. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice urgent, his hand gripping her arm. "Stay hidden. Don't come out until I tell you." But Katerina refused to be left behind. She had faced danger before. She had stood by Enzo's side. She had fought for their love. She wouldn't cower in fear now. "No," she said, her voice firm and decisive. "I'm with you. We fight together." Enzo hesitated, his eyes searching hers, a mixture of concern and admiration swirling within them. He knew that she was strong, that she was courageous, that she was his equal. "All right," he agreed, his voice a low murmur. "But stay close. And be careful." They moved together, fighting their way through the chaos, defending their temporary home, protecting each other. Enzo, a skilled and ruthless fighter, took down several attackers, his movements swift and precise, his aim deadly. Katerina, armed with a pistol Enzo had given her, provided cover, her shots surprisingly accurate, her fear channeled into a fierce determination. They fought side by side, a united front against the onslaught of their enemies. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they refused to surrender. They were fighting for their lives, for their love, for their future. As they battled their way through the villa, they encountered Antonio De Luca, his face contorted with rage and jealousy, his eyes blazing with a murderous intent. He was leading the attack, fueled by his wounded pride, his thwarted ambitions, his obsession with Katerina. "You took her from me, Enzo," he screamed, his voice hoarse with fury. "You stole my bride. You ruined everything." "She was never yours, Antonio," Enzo retorted, his voice cold and defiant. "She chose me. She chose love." Antonio lunged at Enzo, a knife flashing in his hand. They grappled fiercely, their bodies locked in a deadly embrace. Katerina, seeing Enzo in danger, raised her pistol, her finger on the trigger. But before she could fire, another figure emerged from the shadows. Alessandro Esposito, Katerina's father, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. He raised his own weapon, pointing it at Antonio. "Stop, Antonio," he commanded, his voice ringing out through the chaos. "This ends now." Antonio froze, his eyes widening in surprise and disbelief. He looked at Alessandro, then at Katerina, then at Enzo, his expression a mixture of confusion and betrayal. What are you doing?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm protecting my daughter," Alessandro said, his voice firm and resolute. "And ending this feud, once and for all." He had finally seen the truth, finally understood the depth of Katerina's love for Enzo, finally realized the futility of the ancient hatred that had consumed their families for generations. He had chosen love over hate, peace over violence, family over tradition. With Alessandro's intervention, the tide of the battle turned. Antonio's men, seeing their leader disarmed and defeated, surrendered. The fighting ceased. The storm had broken, and in its aftermath, a new dawn was beginning to break. The confrontation had been brutal, the revelation shocking, but the outcome was a chance for a new beginning. Chapter 17. Wounds of the Heart, Scars of the Soul. The aftermath of the attack was a scene of devastation. The villa, once a peaceful sanctuary, was now riddled with bullet holes, scarred by explosions, a testament to the violence that had erupted. Several of Enzo's guards lay injured, some seriously. Antonio De Luca was taken into custody, his dreams of revenge shattered, his future uncertain. Caterina, despite her outward composure during the fight, was deeply shaken. The adrenaline that had fueled her courage was fading, replaced by a wave of nausea and a trembling that she couldn't control. She clung to Enzo, her body pressed against his, seeking comfort, seeking reassurance, seeking love. Enzo held her close, his arms wrapped around her, his voice a soothing murmur in her ear. "It's all right, Cara," he said, his breath warm against her skin. "It's over. You're safe." But even as he spoke those words, he knew that it wasn't truly over. The physical wounds would heal, the scars would fade, but the emotional trauma, the psychological damage, would linger. They had both been through hell, they had both witnessed violence, they had both almost died. Alessandro Esposito approached them, his face etched with concern, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and relief. He looked at Caterina, his daughter, his rebel, and saw not a traitor, but a woman of strength, of courage, of love. "Caterina," he said softly, his voice choked with emotion. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She couldn't bring herself to look at him, to face the man she had defied, the father she had disappointed. Alessandro reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "About everything. About Enzo. About you." He had witnessed her bravery, her loyalty, her unwavering love for Enzo. He had seen the truth, not just in the evidence presented to him, but in the actions of his own daughter, in the bond she shared with the man he had once considered his enemy. Caterina finally looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She saw not the stern, unyielding patriarch, but a man humbled by experience, a father who had finally understood. "Papa," she whispered, her voice trembling. He pulled her into his arms, a fierce, protective embrace. It was a moment of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of healing. The wounds of the heart were beginning to mend, the scars of the soul were starting to fade. Enzo, watching this scene, felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, of gratitude, of hope. He had fought for Caterina, he had risked everything for her, and now, finally, he had won. Not just her love, but her family's acceptance, their blessing. The days that followed were a time of recovery, of rebuilding, of planning for the future. The injured were tended to, the villa was repaired, the security was strengthened. But more importantly, the relationships between the two families began to heal. Alessandro Esposito, a changed man, publicly renounced the feud, extending an olive branch to the Costas, seeking a lasting peace. Enzo, with Caterina by his side, accepted the offer, eager to put an end to the centuries of violence and hatred. The wounds of the heart, the scars of the soul, would take time to fully heal. But with love, with forgiveness, with a shared commitment to a new future, they were on the path to recovery, to reconciliation, to peace. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape scarred but cleansed, ready for new growth, new hope, a new beginning. Chapter 18. A desperate gamble for love and life. Despite the newfound peace between the Esposito and Costa families, a lingering threat remained: Ricardo's family. While Ricardo himself was imprisoned, his relatives, fueled by vengeance and a thirst for power, were still at large, plotting their revenge. Enzo knew that they wouldn't rest until they had struck back, until they had punished him for exposing their treachery. He received intelligence reports, whispers of clandestine meetings, of arms being gathered, of alliances being forged with other disgruntled factions within the underworld. He knew that he had to act, to preempt their attack, to protect Katerina, to protect their future. He decided on a desperate gamble, a risky maneuver designed to draw out his enemies, to force a confrontation, to end the threat once and for all. He planned a public gathering, a celebration of the newfound peace between the two families, a symbolic event designed to showcase their unity, their strength, their resolve. It was a dangerous proposition, a blatant invitation to his enemies, a trap laid in plain sight. But Enzo believed it was the only way. He couldn't live in fear, constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the inevitable attack. He had to take control, to dictate the terms of the engagement, to fight for his life, for his love, for his future. Katerina, when she learned of his plan, was initially opposed. She feared for his safety, for their future, for everything they had fought so hard to achieve. "It's too dangerous, Enzo," she argued, her voice filled with concern. "They'll come for you. They'll try to kill you." "I know," he replied, his voice calm and resolute. "But it's a risk I have to take. I can't live like this. We can't live like this. Constantly afraid." He explained his strategy, his reasoning, his belief that this was the only way to secure their future, to ensure their safety, to build a life together. He convinced her, not with force, but with logic, with passion, with love. The celebration was held at the Costa Villa, the scene of so much pain and betrayal, now transformed into a symbol of hope and reconciliation. Guests arrived from both families, the elders, the younger generation, even some former rivals, all united in their desire for peace. The atmosphere was tense, electric, charged with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Everyone knew the risk, everyone understood the danger, but they were determined to stand together, to show their solidarity, to defy their enemies. Enzo, with Katerina by his side, moved through the crowd, greeting guests, exchanging pleasantries, his eyes constantly scanning the faces, searching for any sign of threat, any hint of danger. He was a lion in his den, protecting his pride, guarding his love. As the evening progressed, the tension mounted. The music played, the guests danced, the conversations flowed, but beneath the surface, a current of fear, of uncertainty, of impending doom, ran through the gathering. Then it happened. A sudden explosion rocked the villa, throwing guests to the ground, shattering glass, plunging the room into darkness. Gunfire erupted, screams filled the air, chaos reigned. Ricardo's family had arrived. Enzo, reacting instantly, pulled Katerina to safety, shielding her with his body. He drew his weapon, his eyes blazing with a cold, determined fury. He was ready. He had been waiting for this. The battle was fierce, brutal, a desperate struggle for survival. Enzo and his guards fought valiantly, protecting the guests, defending their home, fighting for their future. Katerina, refusing to be left behind, joined the fight, her courage unwavering, her determination fueled by her love for Enzo. The gamble had paid off. The trap had been sprung. But the outcome was still uncertain. The night was a maelstrom of violence and chaos, a final showdown between love and hate, between peace and revenge, between life and death. The celebration had turned into a bloodbath, but amidst the carnage, a desperate hope for a future free from fear still flickered. Chapter 19. Reclaiming Power, Embracing Destiny. The fighting raged throughout the villa, a chaotic dance of death and destruction. Enzo, a whirlwind of controlled fury, moved through the carnage, his every shot precise, his every movement calculated. He was fighting not just for survival, but for the future he and Katerina had so desperately craved. Katerina, despite her initial fear, fought with a fierce determination she didn't know she possessed. The image of Enzo, his love for her, his unwavering belief in their future, fueled her courage. She stayed close to him, providing cover, her shots surprisingly effective, her presence a constant reassurance. Amidst the chaos, Enzo spotted the leader of the attackers, Ricardo's cousin, Marco, distinct from Katerina's brother, a ruthless and ambitious man driven by vengeance and a thirst for power. He was the mastermind behind the attack, the one who had orchestrated the chaos, the one who had to be stopped. Enzo, with Katerina by his side, fought his way towards Marco, dodging bullets, taking down attackers, their movements synchronized, their trust in each other absolute. They were a force to be reckoned with, a couple united by love, fighting for their destiny. They finally cornered Marco in the grand ballroom, the scene of the earlier celebration, now a scene of devastation. Marco, his face contorted with rage and desperation, raised his weapon, aiming at Enzo. "You ruined everything," he screamed, his voice hoarse with fury. "You took everything from us. You betrayed your own kind." "I chose love over hate," Enzo retorted, his voice cold and defiant. "I chose peace over violence. I chose Katerina." Marco fired, but Enzo was faster. He shot Marco, the bullet hitting its mark, sending Marco sprawling to the ground, his weapon clattering across the floor. The fighting began to subside. Marco's men, seeing their leader defeated, surrendered. The attack had been repelled. The threat, for now, had been neutralized. Enzo rushed to Katerina, his hands checking her for injuries, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right, Kara?" he asked, his voice urgent, his breath ragged. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Just shaken." They held each other close, their bodies trembling, their hearts pounding, their love a beacon of hope amidst the devastation. They had survived. They had won. But the victory was bittersweet. The villa was damaged, many were injured, and the emotional scars of the battle would linger. The cost of peace had been high, the price of freedom even higher. In the aftermath of the attack, Enzo took decisive action. He used his influence, his connections, his power to ensure that Ricardo's family was completely dismantled, their assets seized, their influence eradicated. He made it clear that any further attempts at revenge would be met with swift and brutal retribution. He also worked to strengthen the alliance between the Esposito and Costa families, forging a new bond, a new understanding, a new future. Alessandro Esposito, fully embracing the reconciliation, supported Enzo's efforts, his own family now united behind him. Katerina, recovering from the trauma of the attack, found a new strength, a new purpose. She became actively involved in the efforts to rebuild, to heal, to create a better world. She used her intelligence, her compassion, her love, to bridge the gap between the two families, to foster understanding, to build a lasting peace. They had reclaimed their power, not through violence, but through unity, through love, through forgiveness. They had embraced their destiny, a destiny they had chosen for themselves, a destiny free from the shackles of the past, a destiny filled with hope. The battle had been won, but the war for a better future was just beginning. And they were ready to fight it together. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. With Ricardo's family neutralized and the alliance between the Espositos and Costas solidified, a fragile peace settled over their world. However, one loose end remained: Antonio De Luca. Imprisoned after the attack on the safe house, he simmered with resentment, his pride wounded, his ambitions thwarted. He refused to accept his defeat, clinging to the hope of revenge, of reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. Enzo and Katerina, aware of the potential threat Antonio still posed, decided to confront him, to offer him a chance at redemption, a chance to break free from the cycle of violence and hatred that had consumed him. They visited him in prison, a stark, sterile environment that reflected the emptiness of his life, the futility of his choices. He looked at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "You," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You ruined everything. You stole my life. You chose your own path, Antonio," Enzo said, his voice calm and resolute. "You chose violence, you chose revenge, you chose hatred." "She was mine," Antonio retorted, his gaze fixed on Katerina.
"She was promised to me."
"I was never yours, Antonio," Katerina said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I was a pawn, a prize, a possession. I chose love."
"I chose Enzo,"
she explained to him, patiently and compassionately, the truth about the feud, about Ricardo's treachery, about the lies that had fueled the hatred between their families for generations. She spoke of her own journey, her own transformation, her own choice. Enzo offered Antonio a chance to start over, to leave the past behind, to build a new life. He offered him financial assistance, a chance to relocate, a chance to escape the cycle of violence that had consumed him. Antonio listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He was a man torn between his desire for revenge and the glimmer of hope that Enzo and Caterina offered. He had lost everything, his power, his status, his future. Finally, after a long and agonizing silence, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Why are you doing this? He asked, his eyes searching theirs. Why are you helping me? Because we believe in forgiveness. Antonio, Enzo replied, his voice filled with sincerity. Because we believe in second chances. Because we believe in peace. Antonio looked at them, his gaze shifting between Enzo and Caterina, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He had never experienced such kindness, such compassion, such love. He broke down, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with sobs. He finally realized the futility of his hatred, the emptiness of his revenge, the waste of his life. He accepted their offer, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for giving me a chance. It was a moment of profound transformation, a testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of love, the possibility of redemption. The final confrontation had not been one of violence, but of hearts and loyalties, a battle won not with weapons, but with compassion, with understanding, with love. With Antonio's acceptance, the last vestige of the old feud, the final obstacle to peace, was removed. Enzo and Caterina had faced their demons, they had overcome their challenges, they had won. They had fought for their love, they had fought for their future, and they had triumphed. They left the prison, hand in hand, their hearts filled with hope, their future stretching before them, bright and promising. They had navigated a treacherous path, filled with violence, betrayal, and heartbreak, but they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more in love than ever before. The final confrontation had been a victory, not just over their enemies, but over the darkness within themselves, a triumph of love over hate, of peace over violence, of hope over despair. The future was theirs to create, and they were ready to embrace it, together. Epilogue. Years passed. The Costa and Esposito families, once bitter enemies, became close allies, their bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity and strengthened by the love of Enzo and Caterina. The feud, a relic of a bygone era, was relegated to the history books, a cautionary tale of the destructive power of hatred and the transformative power of forgiveness. Enzo and Caterina, their love deepened by the trials they had overcome, built a life together, a life filled with joy, with laughter, with family. They had children, beautiful, strong children who grew up in a world free from the shadows of the past, a world where Espositos and Costas were friends, not foes. The Costa Villa, once a symbol of power and intrigue, became a home, a place of warmth and welcome, a haven for their growing family. The gardens, where so much violence had once occurred, now bloomed with vibrant life, a testament to the resilience of nature, the enduring power of love. Caterina, no longer the reluctant bride, the stolen captive, blossomed into a strong, independent woman, a leader in her community, a champion of peace and reconciliation. She used her influence, her intelligence, her compassion, to heal the wounds of the past, to build bridges between divided communities, to create a better world. Enzo, softened by Caterina's love, became a wise and just leader, respected and admired by all. He ruled not with fear, but with compassion, not with violence, but with understanding, not with hatred, but with love. He had learned from his past, he had embraced his destiny, and he had become the man Caterina had always believed he could be. Alessandro Esposito, a changed man, lived to see his grandchildren grow up, to witness the fruits of the peace he had helped to forge. He and Isabella, their own relationship rekindled by the events of the past, found a quiet happiness in their later years, their love a testament to the enduring power of forgiveness. Antonio de Luca, true to his word, built a new life for himself, far from the world of organized crime. He found peace, he found purpose, he found redemption. He never forgot the kindness of Enzo and Caterina, the second chance they had given him, and he lived his life in gratitude, striving to make amends for his past mistakes. One warm evening, as the sun set over the Mediterranean Sea, casting a golden glow over the Costa Villa, Enzo and Caterina stood on the balcony, their arms wrapped around each other, their children playing in the gardens below. They looked out at the horizon, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with love. "We did it, Cara," Enzo said softly, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm against her skin. "We overcame it all." Caterina smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "Yes," she replied, her voice equally soft.
We did. Together.
They had faced the darkness, they had fought for their love, they had built a future together, a future filled with hope, with promise, with endless possibilities. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale, but in the real world, a world they had helped to create, a world where love had conquered hate, where peace had triumphed over violence, where forgiveness had healed the wounds of the past. Their love story, born in the shadows of a forbidden world, had blossomed into a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a legacy of love. The end.